have examined two first concrete problems. The first one, its precise definition was why we must speak English, but finally, the true meaning of a small question was something like I can name the anthropological situation of philosophy. There's a philosophy in its anthropological situation, that is, in its relationship to the world, to the concrete world, to the question of culture, globalization, languages, and so on. And the abstract question is, the general abstract question is, how philosophy can be, in some sense, and within limits, not reducible to anthropological determinations. And the key of the problem is the notion of possibility. Because we understand why. Possibility is something which is inside and outside. Inside, because the possibility must exist in the world, and outside, because if something is possible but not realized, it's not in the world in some sense. So the first question was the relationship between philosophy and possibility. The second concrete problem was the problem of what is our role here, what is our duty, what we must do in the concrete situation of this room. And finally, the general problem was the dialectical nature of philosophy and the opposition between this dialectical nature of philosophy and the conservative vision of an analytical nature of philosophy. And we have seen, without detailed argumentation, we have seen that this contradiction was a symptom, a philosophical symptom, probably, of the most important contradiction of contemporary world between analytical vision and dialectical vision. And we have seen that all that is a part of the question, what is philosophy? And I give you three possible short references, short readings concerning the question, what is philosophy? And the repetition, the very strange repetition of this question from the beginning of philosophy to today. I think it's possible to read, but it's just an indication, it's an obligation. What is metaphysics of Heidegger? What is philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari? And my manifesto for philosophy. If you accept a narcissistic indication. I come to the third concrete point, which is a very, very concrete. Why there is that sort of situation where an old man speaks to very younger people? You know, the philosophy is also to transform something in a question. Because it's and to understand in what sense it is a question. Probably you know I am 73 old, and so for example, my historical existence, you see this point, includes the Second World War, the Chinese Revolution, the imperialist wars in Algeria, Vietnam, and so on, May 68 in France, Roosevelt, Churchill, Hitler, De Gaulle, Stalin, but also Kennedy, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and so on. And so my historical existence is more important part, not exactly yours. So you can see that my historical world, the becoming of the world, the concrete becoming of the world in my proper life, is the different events, the ruptures, the continuities, and so on are not the same. And my philosophical framework too is specific. For example, it implies Sartre and Heidegger also directly, not as something closed, but as something in becoming. Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Deleuze, and so on. I can see, if you want, that my life goes across practically 4 sequences concerning philosophy. So, manner to give you a sort of approximative knowledge of that sort of history. During the 50s of the last century, the dominant position was in Europa, actually, was phenomenology. Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and so on. And the most important question was probably the question of consciousness, or subjectivity. And maybe the most important question was what exactly is freedom? And in that sort of context, the discussion was between phenomenology on one side, on the other side, something like conservative philosophy was, if you want, conservative philosophy was largely positivism. Philosophy of sciences and so on. So it was the first contradiction in which, as a young man, my first contact with philosophy. But immediately after that, we have something very different, the name of which in France was structuralism. And the name, English name was French theory. But it's the 60s and part of the 70s. It was structuralism that is largely philosophy of structure, philosophy of objective structure, and also philosophy of language. And it was a moment of, naturally, critique of the sequence before, so a strong critique of the concept of subject, a strong critique of consciousness as something which was really the most important question in philosophy. You find something like that in the critique of the concept of humanité by Foucault, the critique of the concept of subjectivité by Althusser, and so on. So, as often, the second sequence was largely a critique of the first sequence, a critique of phenomenology. And so for me, it was something like a difficulty, because I was really Sartrean, in fact. So I was on the side of consciousness, subjectivity, and so on. And it was a difficulty for me to go across a sort of radical critique of the concept of consciousness, and so on, and the apology of structure, determination of the subject by language, and so on. And after that, we have, I think, something like a third sequence. Purely in philosophy, the political sequences are different. During the 80s and 90s, in some sense, which is the sequence of deconstruction and postmodernity. That is the idea of something like the end of philosophy, but not in the analytic sense, the closure and so on, but in the idea that philosophy itself was too close. That the opening of classical philosophy was a form of closure, and the name of this closure was metaphysics. So it was also something Heideggerian in this sequence, because it's a sequence of something like the end of philosophy as the end of metaphysics. But as Derrida learned to us, to say the end is too much. The end itself is a closure. So it's also the end of the end. And also is the continuity of the end, is the end which does not finish really. And this is why deconstruction is infinite. The opening of this construction is infinite. And the end of metaphysics must be also the deconstruction of deconstruction. So it was the idea of a radical opening, an absolute opening, not absolute at the end, as the end of thinking, the goal of thinking, but the absolute as the realization by itself infinite of the end. And so it was a radical critique also of some aspect of the sequence before, because the sequence before was constructivist and not on deconstruction. The structuralism was a constructivism, to construct structure, to understand the thing itself by its structure. So the sequence of postmodernity and deconstruction is the sequence of critique of that sort of constructivism. To construct the idea of construction is finally also a closure. So we have to deconstruct the construction, and so on and so on, because we have to do the deconstruction of the deconstruction of the deconstruction of the deconstruction of the construction. And so it's the idea which was in the first appearance in philosophy, the idea of an infinite task, with infinite obligation, something which has no immanent end. And also another aspect was to assume all the past. It's clear in this postmodernity, in the field of artistic creation, for example. Postmodernity is also, we can also have a sort of game with all forms. We are no obliged to a new form and only a new form. We have also a freedom to open the game of all forms. It was particularly clear in architecture. But during this sequence, we have also an academic reaction. The reactive position is very strong. And maybe it was really true in the Anglo-Saxon world and in the United States, in England and so on. The contradiction was the contradiction between deconstruction and analytic philosophy, strictly speaking. During this sequence. And for example, something like me, but Deleuze too, was outside the contradiction. Because it was not, the Deleuzean position, or my position, was not a position postmodern, like the position of Lyotard, for example, and some others, and was not at all the analytic position. So we were not on the side of Derrida, but we were not on the side of the enemies of Derrida. And so we were in some sense outside the contradiction, the violent contradiction of this sequence. And after that, maybe we have something like a new sequence, which is probably obscure and not completely, which is something which comes after that sort of contradiction, after the contradiction between Derridean deconstruction, postmodernity, and so on, and the academic reaction in the form of the strongness of analytic point of view. The English word is postmodernity. Postmodernity. Is it possible that the sequence after was postmodernity? No, so it's a closure of repetition, the form of closure. But I understand what is postmodernity in the sense that we return to some concepts of classical philosophy without being in academic reaction. I understand my definition of something like that. we are not in deconstruction and postmodernity because we can assume that some metaphysical concepts like being, subject, truth, and so on, are valid. So the appearance is that we return to metaphysics, finally. It's the case also for Deleuze, not only for me. Deleuze has written that the question of metaphysics is not a problem for you. There is no problem to assume that our position is a metaphysical one. Because precisely we are not in the field of the sequence of deconstruction of metaphysical concepts. So we can assume some classical concepts of metaphysics, but without being in the return to metaphysics sequence of the history of philosophy. So we must give new meanings to all classical concepts. We shall return to this problem after. And this is why I understand postmodernity in this sense. It's not postmodernity, it's not deconstruction or freedom of game in all forms and so on, and radical critiques of metaphysics and of all concepts of metaphysics, subject, truth, and so on. So we are not naturally in analytic and academic reaction to all that. So we are beyond that sort of contradiction. And to be beyond that sort of contradiction defines, in some sense, a new sequence. Maybe it's a sequence of postmodernity. I can accept the name. And so we can see all that constitutes four sequences in 50 years and something more, practically 50 or 60 years of my life, my personal life. And I can say something else, that during practically the two first sequences, we have two fundamental references which are Marxism and psychoanalysis. Marx and Freud, if you want. For everybody, in some sense. Everybody which is in the phenomenological framework, the sense of Sartre or Merleau-Ponty, or everybody which is in the sense, in the field of structuralism, are these two major references. So there is something in Marxism and psychoanalysis which is not reducible to the succession of sequences, which is across the sequences. And you know that, in fact, in the third sequence, somebody as Derrida is also in constant discussion with Freud and Marx. Derrida wrote about Marx directly, book, an entire book. So you see, it's very interesting to see that in European philosophy, continental, Marxism and psychoanalysis go across the three first sequences, which are, on other points, very different, very opposite. And probably the end of all that, of the three first sequences, was a very strong reaction against these two references. On the form in France of the new philosophers, and so on. And today we have a very violent fight concerning Freud. So maybe the particularity of post-modernity with Deleuze, me, in some sense, Lavoisier, in France, Quentin Meillassoux, young men, and so on, is to return to these two references, to assume, in some sense, completely that we are in discussion, necessary discussion with Marxism and with Marx and Freud. So, my philosophical framework, is first go across very violent forms of multiplicity, 4 sequences, maybe very different, very opposite. So we are really in the definition of philosophy by Kant, because Kant was saying that philosophy is a battlefield. Battlefield. So it's true in all these sequences, all this context, battlefield and victory, apparent victory of some tendencies against some other tendencies, and also return of something which was dead, and so on. Philosophy is also that, as a return of the dead. Something, thinking which is absolutely abolished and has disappeared, returned. And so my historical context is very different, and my philosophical context is made of very complex sequences, and it's really a very violent battlefield. But boy, I stop here. But I can say, for example, that my artistic context is also completely different. It's a very complex history from the beginning of abstract painting to the modern form of deconstruction in the field of art and so on. And it's a very complex history in music too, all that. And the last, enormous transformation inside the question of difference of sexes, the question of sexuality as such, of love and so on, the relationship between men and women and so on, during this sequence of time, this 50 years, 60 years, there are very fundamental transformations in this field. So finally, in philosophy, in politics, in history, in artistical, in art, and in concrete existence, this sequence, my personal life, is a sequence of apparition and disparition of many things, really. It's the contrary of the conservative idea of the world as it is, as a unique horizon. My personal experience is experience of very numerous ruptures in all fields of human activity. And it is why I say that maybe my vision cannot be exactly the same as the vision of something today, a young woman today, not because the world is not the same. It is really sort of coincidence. But more profoundly, because my experience is not at all the experience of continuity, of the existence of the world, but fundamentally an experience of rupture. And sometimes I can say to myself that my vision of the necessity and of ruptures is only my biography. It's only something like a philosophical projection of my life. When we cannot say that your life was in a false world. If the world today is the true world, it's really true that we are in a moment of history where the world as it is must continue. It's true also, if it's true also that my experience, my personal experience during my life is in fact in contradiction with this world. And maybe it's a terrible hypothesis. My philosophical vision of the world is only a projection of my world, my experience, my individual life, as a norm for the world as it is. If I desire a new possibility, maybe it's only because my life was a life with many sequences, new emergencies, new possibilities, catastrophic wars, resistance, revolt, and so on and so on. And that now we are progressively the peaceful globalization of the world, which is in fact a stable world, a good world, and so on. And if it is true, my first question, why as an old man I am speaking to very younger people, was in fact the question of a contradiction. A contradiction between a vision of the world which result of a world which was in fact different from the world of today. No, it was not the same world. Not only by some little differences, but most probably because it was the world of change, the world of revolution, in all fields of human activity, not only in politics, in history and so on, but also very violent ruptures in the history of art and so on. So it was not only a different world, but a world, the law of the Greek laws of which was different. A world under different laws of the becoming of the world. And so the situation would be a dialectical one, in fact, because it would be the situation of a contradiction between two different, absolutely different experiences of the world as it is. And there is two possibilities. If all that is true, then my position is not exactly true. You can explore this possibility. If the situation is that sort of situation, see, the confrontation between two experiences, two fundamental experiences of the world that are absolutely different. The situation, right? There are two possibilities. The first one is that I only can transmit you my experience. And after that, you do what you want with this experience. The first possibility, a possibility which transforms our philosophical position in maybe an historical one. If that is a unique possibility, finally it's an historical situation where something of the past is transmitted to you, naturally with philosophical concepts and so on, but the exercise of ourselves is an exercise of transmission. And it's interesting. It's not directly critical of this position. It's interesting, but it's an exercise of transmission. Finally, my duty is to transmit you an experience of the world which is so different that you can do something with this difference. But in some sense, it's not exactly a philosophical experience, it's much more an historical experience of transmission. The second possibility is that this experience is in fact not principally an experience of transmission in its historical sense, meaning, but it's an experience of the strange relationship between philosophy and time, generally speaking. You know, and it's a profound difference, which is a subtle one between the first possibility and the second. The third possibility is to assume that my experience, and in fact, to my philosophical experience, the four sequences and so on, that all that can only be transmitted to you, and that is not possible immediately to produce common results to this contradiction. So it would not be exactly possible what I was speaking before, the creation of a new common desire. No, it was not exactly. Finally, if I transmit to you my experience, I don't know exactly what you can do with this experience, naturally, because I cannot be on the two sides. So you know, in this vision of the situation of my confrontation between my experience and your situation in the world today, the first possibility is reduced to be, in some sense, not a philosophical one. Not only because it is historical in its very nature, but much more because I cannot hope to create in you directly something like a new desire which would be common with mine. And to create a new community between you, or me included in this community. It cannot be exactly that, because I cannot really know what is the use for you of my experience. Okay. In the second possibility, it's different. It's different because the point is, maybe the relationship of philosophy to time is not that sort of contradiction. Is not reducible at all to the contradiction between my experience and your experience. Actually, this difference is important and defines a sort of contradiction. But if philosophy has a rapport to the time which is not reducible to the present, it's possible that we can have simultaneously, you and me, some use of the contradiction which is common to you and to me. It's a possibility. It's a possibility, but if philosophy is not reducible to the present. And you recognize in this point the conviction that in analytic vision, philosophy is reducible to the problems of the present. This is why we can say in analytic vision that what is important is the papers of the 10 last years. 10 last years is the present. The problems and the answers are the problems and answers of the present, and we have to solve this problem. So if the analytic vision, the difference in the time between two experiences cannot be useful for the present. And this is why you find very often in the analytic position that all that, Plato, Descartes, and Sartre, and all that is old. This is the point. It's too old to be useful. Exactly like a mathematician was saying that, okay, Euclid is very well, it's true, but there is no contemporary direct use of Euclid to solve the contemporary problems of mathematics. Mathematician, in fact, works with the modernity of the problems. If philosophy was in analytic position, we cannot use the difference between past and present in a common way. So, you understand the problem. The question is to propose the idea that the relationship between philosophy and time is not absolutely reducible to the present of philosophy. We can say something like that. In philosophy, the question is the question of the future. So it's a question of the present. That is the question of the present from the point of view of the possibility of the future. We assume this position, what I name the dialectical position. But this construction of the possibility of the future in the present is also constructed by a new transmission of the past. All the words are of some importance. So, the question, I repeat, the question of the philosophy is possibility of the future in the present. So in some sense, you can say that the question of the philosophy is also the present, I assume. It's not the present as the world as it is, but the present as the possibility of something different, which is in the present of the possibility. It's a very simple question, the question of the present of a possibility. The possibility is something concerning the future, but the point is that this possibility exists in the present. Donc, the future exists in the present in the form of the possibility. Donc, if philosophy is really something like that, there's something which helps the existence of the possibility of the present. There is a construction of the future by the means of possibility, and I propose to say that in philosophy specifically, this construction of the future in the present is also a new transmission of the past. And a consequence of this point is that the present of philosophy is also composed by the totality of its past. The present of the philosophy is also constructed by the totality of its past. So the present of philosophy is the largest present possible. Is a very big present. A present which is also made of the totality of the philosophical past. Not by the repetition of its past. That is a purely academic position, reactive. The repetition of the past. In France, for example, we know perfectly that it's the reduction of philosophy to the history of philosophy. It's an academic position. Strictly speaking, it's a purely academic position, and it's not what I am saying here. I am saying here that, in fact, the present of philosophy is the totality of its past, not by repetition or history of its past, but by the proposition of a new interpretation of its past, or part of its past. And why this new interpretation of the past in the present? For precisely the construction of a future. And the construction of a future which is also a big future, and not a small future. A future which is as big as the past, you know? A future which is as big as the past, because in the construction of this future, there is new interpretation of the past. There is a complete contemporary of philosophy to itself. Plato is with us now. It's not something old, which is completely abolished. It's not dogmatic, substantialist, and so on, and we have no use of all that. Not at all. Philosophy exists because, precisely, Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes, and Kant, and so on, are with us. Now, they are not, why they are with us now? Because we have a use of all these philosophers as a part of the construction of the future. As a part of the construction of the future by a new interpretation of the past. And so, in this future, which is in some sense completely, which is a real future, completely different, we are really in the future, in the historical future, because precisely in this future there is also the presence of the totality of the philosophical past. Because the new interpretation of Plato, for example, is a new interpretation for the future. So in this future, we have a new Plato. And this new Plato will be the new present of the future. And it's only in philosophy that we have something like that. Only in philosophy. Naturally, maybe it's also a possibility in theater. It's another problem. I shall speak of this problem. The problem of relationship between philosophy and theater. It's a very, very complex problem from the very beginning. You know why? Because in theater also we play Sophocles and Aeschylus and so on. So they are with us. And there is naturally a new interpretation. Because certainly we play Sophocles in a very different manner than Sophocles for the Greek. And so in theater too, we have constantly the possibility of a new interpretation of the past for the future. For the future. But this philosophy is absolutely essential. And so we have in a contradiction also, because a part of reactive position in philosophy is to say, finally, philosophy, it's nothing else than the history of philosophy. So we study Plato, Aristotle, and so on, but in a reactive manner. Exactly like somebody who desires the return of all the religious form of existence. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's a fetishization of the past. Fetishization. But the other position, which is the analytic position, which is all that is closed. No interest in all these old philosophers. We have to do and solve the contemporary problems uniquely. It's, in fact, a conservative position. It's a conservative position. So it's exactly the same contradiction that we have between reactive position and conservative position. And we have to use in another manner all the past. Not to repeat and historically and to return to the past, but not to abolish this past, but to interpret this past in the light of the future. And so we have to explain also how is it possible that the present of philosophy is also the interpretation of the past for the future. And it is naturally the second interpretation of my speech here. An experience, an historical experience completely different, which is a composition of your past, can be transmitted in the guise of a new interpretation, in something which is common, you and me, which is the future. We can have the same future, you and me. And if we can create a community, it's naturally because we can have this point in common, which is, in the world as it is, the possibility of a new future. And it's a very strong idea. The unity of humanity is, in the point of view of future, it's a necessity. It's not only the philosophical symptom, or is that in philosophy we clearly see that the past, all the past, under a new interpretation, is useful for the creation of a new future. But finally, more generally speaking, if you have the dream of a community of the generic humanity, beyond the differences of sexes, nationality, culture, and so on, and the existence of a generic humanity which respects the differences, with the differences inside this form of unity, it's clear that this community is a community from the point of view of the future. Because how many are different, the people, they have the same, they can have the same future. The future can unify them in their differences. And this is exactly why philosophy is important, because it is a sort of paradigm of all that. In philosophy, clearly, all the past is with us. And all the past is with us because we can have a future by the means of a new interpretation of this past. And so, if all that is true, when I speak to you, it's not only the transmission, the historical transmission of an experience, which is different from your experience, but is a sort of experimentation of the philosophical possibility to transform the past into future. Transform the past into future. That is precisely the fundamental goal of philosophy. And it is also a clear answer to the reason for what you and me are in this room, across the very important difference of historical experiences, philosophical experiences, artistical experiences, and so on. And this answer is positive because, in fact, this is not reducible to a pure exercise of transmission, which would be something interesting, but something very different than a philosophical experience. So, after these three concrete problems and the generalization of these concrete problems, I can propose something like that. We have defined three subjects for us, for our continuation. First, the anthropological nature of philosophy, relationship between philosophy and anthropological circumstances. Or, if you want, the philosophy as an exception, as for part an exception, or the relationship between universality and particularity in philosophy. Or another relationship between universality of truth and particularity of culture. Philosophy is a symptom of this very important problem today. Universality of truth and particularity of culture. We shall see that this relationship between universality and particularity is today the most important philosophical problem and the most difficult. Second, the dialectical nature of philosophy. Dialectical nature of philosophy is the question of the rupture in philosophy, or the question of philosophy as a thinking of ruptures and relationship between continuity and rupture, something like that. So the question of possibility. The question of possibility inside the world as it is. Or the question of relationship between past, present, and future from the point of view of the dialectical nature of philosophy. But more precisely, dialectical nature of philosophy is the question of what is, in philosophy, the fundamental contradiction first. What is the fundamental contradiction in philosophy, and what is the goal of philosophy? So we have said something like that for the moment, but we have to decide, naturally. The idea is that the fundamental contradiction in philosophy is a subjective one, and that the goal is a common desire. Not a common state, a common dimension, a common existence, but a common desire. And this is and third, the paradoxical relationship between philosophy and time. So, we have a good program in 3 points, and we shall begin the treatment of this program this afternoon. Thank you to all.